In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahu. طبعا ما عندي ساعة. مو مشكلة عاد أشغل. So welcome to this 17th session, lesson 13 from the book. As we said in the previous lesson, at this point the author, after having presented the proofs for the existence of God and presented the attributes of God, both of essence and existence, he wants to spend a little bit of time explaining why some people may still not believe. So the claim, or the implied claim, is that what we have presented is very solid logically. So any human being, if they are objective, if they are sincere in their seeking of the truth, should naturally believe in what we have presented so far. Everything looks like it's very logically sound. There are no issues at the logical level, at the rational level, in everything that has been presented. So in the last lesson, we covered a number of factors that may lead people to decide consciously or unconsciously end up not believing. In this lesson, he continues with that same general theme, but this time he's going to go a little bit more into the rational objections. So given what we have said until now about worldviews and about there's a divine worldview and a, let's call it materialistic worldview, a non-divine, a non-religious worldview, an atheistic worldview, and the proofs that have been presented for the existence of God, and those are the attributes of God. Here's where we're going to see some of the objections. If someone has been following the lessons rigorously, classically from the beginning until now completely, a lot of what we're going to say in this lesson, we touched on it or we actually covered it in previous lessons. But the author still decided to stop and spend time specifically presenting the objection as an objection and presenting an answer to it. So in this lesson, he's going to concentrate on 4 objections. These are very classic objections, and we could spend 10, 15, 20 lectures on each one of these objections if we wanted to go in depth, mention all the books and all the authors and all the throughout history who have used this and who claims that this is strong or weak nowadays. So these are just very let's call it a superficial presentation of these objections and some of the possible answers we give to them, but there's a lot more that could be said about each one of these. So the first one of the objections is belief in an immaterial being. So people object to believing in God because they can't see Him, they can't feel His presence because He's not a physical material being. So that's the first objection. The second one, role of fear and / ignorance in the belief in God. So this is a huge claim that has existed for quite some time now. Probably since the beginning of what we call sociology until now, this has been very, very common as an objection to religion and religious people. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That fear is at the heart of humanity's adopting the belief of God. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The third objection has to do with the principle of causality. And is it a universal principle or not? And we spent, I think, a lot of time on this one, so we should go very quickly on it. And the last one is the findings or the conclusions of empirical science or natural science in general. So do the conclusions, the findings of natural science, are they contradicted? Are they incompatible with the belief in a God or not? So let's start with the first objection, belief in an immaterial being. So the objection in general is simply saying that it's very difficult for me to believe in a God or an entity in general, but in God specifically, that's our topic, in a God that I cannot see, that I cannot feel, and I can only believe in things that are perceivable, that I can ascertain their existence through sense perception. So one way to present this objection is a very simple way, just like I kind of presented it now. And there's a much more sophisticated way to present it. But at the core, this is the objection. The simple version is what we just said. Someone says, I only believe in things that I can conclude with certainty that they exist because my five senses allow me to conclude that they exist. Otherwise, I don't believe, I'm not sure, I can't believe in it. The more sophisticated version has to do with thinkers and philosophers that throughout history have put a much more, let's say, complex theory around this. So we have people who talk about physicalism, materialism, empiricism, and who rely entirely on the senses before, and of course there's a whole theory of knowledge behind it, that human beings can only know things that they learned through the five senses when they're born, and they're born as a tabula rasa with John Locke and David Hume and others. They really insisted on this. So a lot of the philosophical foundations for these kinds of beliefs, although they existed from ancient Greece, they came from around that time. So what are the big answers to this? What do we say to someone who says, I can only believe in a God if I could feel him, if I could sense him through my perception? What are my ways of perception? So the first thing is to make sure that we all agree on how sense perception works. For me to know that there's any phenomena in the world, I have to have some access to it through one of my five senses. So let's say I have eyes that see. Okay. So to start with, if I look at my sight gives me access to a limited amount, a limited spectrum of natural phenomena. I cannot hear with my eyes. I can't taste with my eyes. I can't feel with my eyes. I can't smell with my eyes. I can only see. So already this should trigger a questioning or a flag for anyone that we need specific faculties, specific senses for specific types of phenomena. I can't access the whole world through this one faculty. Okay, so that's good. And luckily for us, we have more than one faculty. We have other faculties. So now we have to look at the faculties. When I look at my sight, when I study my sight and I look at the phenomena that I can access through my sight, am I covering the entire spectrum, the entire inventory of things that I could potentially see with my eyes? And we know now, as human beings, with all the studies and research that we're doing, that's definitely no. Human beings see a limited spectrum of the light. There are things that we can't see. There's infrared and ultraviolet that we don't see. There's plenty that we don't see. And when we study other beings, other animals for instance, we know that they do see them. Some of them do. And we don't even know everything that they see. But we're sure that a lot of them can very easily see infrared. Some of them see ultraviolet. Some of them only see in infrared or ultraviolet. And some of them can't see in addition in infrared or ultraviolet, for instance. That already tells us that our sight is limited. So first of all, our sight does not give us access to all the phenomena. So one faculty does not give you access to all the phenomena. It only gives you access to a type of phenomena. And then even that type, we're not able to cover it entirely. We can only cover a part of it. The rest is outside of what that faculty can see. And then the same thing if we look at the way we feel the world, for instance. Our skin feels. We have nerve endings that allow us to feel things. But we know that other creatures feel a lot more. There's a lot of creatures in the sea or air, they have, let's say, types of hair on their body that sense all the vibrations around them, and they know anything going on. And we see that with animals, with fish, we have other animals that we all know. They can smell a lot better, they can hear a lot better, and so on and so forth. Like elephants or whales or. Okay. So we know that, first of all, our faculties, they're limited. Not only does every faculty only see a part of the world, of the entire possibilities, and even that type is not fully accessible to us. We only see parts of it. So if we understand that, how can someone just come afterwards and say, if I don't have access to a reality through one of my five senses, I allow myself to say that reality does not exist? Do you know how limited your sense perception is compared to the phenomena of the world? So for you to even say, I want to be a materialist, even if we agree with you that it's okay to be a materialist, your five senses don't even give you access to the full spectrum of being a materialist. That alone is already very deficient. Okay, so that's a full answer. If we look at sense perception and what it is, and we can push that a lot further. How come that I have eyes that can see? What the relationships between the senses? There's a whole lot of argument that we can take out of that. That's a high level argument. So of course we have some other examples here: radiation, magnetism, all types of energy that we know we don't have access to, that the author mentions. He doesn't mention, for instance, that we know that it's been proven for millennia that animals, for instance, they sense a storm coming, and that some of them take animals with them on a ship because that gives them an idea of what's coming, earthquakes, and so on and so forth. Okay, another answer: belief in immaterial entities. Okay, so now we know. We've talked about our sense perception and how we understand the world. That's one answer. Another answer is that, is it really true that we can argue that there are only material, physical entities in the world? So when we look at ourselves, and here it can get a little arguable, but we think that it's extremely weak on the other side. For instance, emotions. If you feel anger, can anyone come and tell you that you're not really feeling anger because you're not sensing it with your five senses? Because it's not felt through empiricism, and empiricism relies on that, and this may be an illusion. Your anger, your happiness, so on and so forth. So these are feelings, fall in that category. They're entities. You have to put them somewhere, and you know you don't have access to them through the five senses. You do have access to them, just not through the five senses, which proves that we do feel directly things not through the five senses. That's one example. Another one, your will. Would anyone argue if I have a will right now to lift this pen? I know what I felt. No one can come and argue with me that I don't have a will because it's not perceptible through the five senses. I have direct access to it. I don't need someone from the outside to argue that. And the big one, and there's books upon books being written about this one, is awareness or consciousness. Can consciousness or awareness really be limited to your sense perception of yourself or not? And of course, this can be argued that it's only all of these, emotions, will, all of that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next lesson. If I remember correctly, we'll talk a little bit more about materialism in general in the next lesson. But for the time being, when people try to reduce all of these and many others to what? To biochemical reactions happening in the body. So your anger, your happiness, your will, your consciousness, they're nothing but biochemical reactions happening either in your brain or in your nervous system. And that's what you feel. So that's the strongest, yeah.
You want to say just an observation? Is it okay?
Yeah.
We will consider ourselves materialists in this world when it comes to knowledge. And even in that, like you said, we're just so limited. So even that we don't have a complete grasp of. And then even when it comes to possessions, we consider ourselves materialist and everything is what we own and have. But even when it comes to that, we really own nothing. From houses that we mortgage heavily, from cars that we lease and finance. So for such a material world and a material perception of the world, we hold no materiality.
It's a very good point.
You know what I mean?
And the Quran insists on that, and the philosophy of understanding life is a lot about that.
So we used to maybe own a house and a horse 100 or 50 years ago, but now we don't even own a car and a house.
Yeah, now it's worse if you add the complexity of life in general. But there's something in the philosophy of our religion and all religion in general about the fact that there are no pure or real pleasures in this life, including the materialistic ones. You might think that they are because you're looking at it very superficially. But that's when they tell you, if you want pleasure, if you want real happiness, at least get it pure. At least get it without the side effects. There is nothing in this world without side effects. And this is the difference between pleasure in this world and pleasure in the next. It's that even when there is a pleasure in this world, even if it looks like it's pleasurable and it's going to give you happiness, it's coming at a cost. So is that price worth it? Is that cost worth it? Is that sacrifice worth it when you know the big picture? That's a huge part of the philosophy of our religion. That's why you say that the real believer is stuck in a jail of this world, and they feel like they've been, because they have a different outlook. They see that even when there is pleasure, it comes chained with all sorts of side effects, all sorts of sacrifices and price that you're paying for it. Anyways, very good point. Okay. Last 2 points. The first one is, so given everything that we've said, we said that basically, if I don't perceive something, I don't have a proof that it exists. If we are to agree with that, that is still not a proof that it doesn't exist. All that it tells me, if I don't feel something, I'm a full materialist. I only rely on sense perception. The most I could say with this is that I do not have a proof that something exists or doesn't exist. Which is different than saying I have proof that it doesn't exist. Not having proof is not proof. To say that something doesn't exist needs a separate proof. And that's why when someone says, I believe in God because I have a proof, okay, they have a proof, we have to study it. When someone says, I don't know if God exists, I have no proof if God exists or not, okay, that's arguable too. But if someone comes and says, I have a proof that he doesn't exist, yeah, that's a really big claim. When someone has a proof that something does not exist, and this is what we're seeing here. So someone wants to be so materialistic that they want to say, my materialism is proof enough that something does not exist. No, your materialism limits you to a sphere of existence, and in that sphere, there's everything else that you're not allowed to talk about. But in that sphere, you may be, or you may not be, allowed to say that something exists or doesn't exist. In that sphere, if you have absolute knowledge of it. And in this case, we know that they don't have absolute knowledge of it. What happened? I don't know. Anyways. I think it's a fuse or something.
Yeah.
Everything shut down. It's okay, we keep going. Belief in non-material is not exceptional. So the last quick point that the author makes here is sometimes now the argument is being flipped. It's as though if a human being believes in something that is non-material, that's the exception. That requires that's strange and bizarre and really almost ridiculous, and it requires proof after proof because they believe in something that is non-material. When the reality is that if we look at the things that we covered and many, many others, if we look at the things we've covered until now, we know that you're not allowed to say that. There's no proof that there's no material entities, and we know for a fact that there are no immaterial entities that are part of our lives that we have access to, like feelings, like will, like consciousness. So keeping all of that in mind, by default should be to be open to the idea that someone believes in something non-material and not rejecting it just because. That's not good enough just to say it's non-material, therefore it's rejected by default. No, it's accepted by default until you establish your proof that it's rejected. The next objection that the author talks about, fear and ignorance. This one is a big topic, as we said, starting from a couple of centuries ago, when some sociologists started looking into how religion got introduced into society. So the claim, the objection and the claim is that human beings, they were primitive creatures and they were living in nature and they were confronted with all sorts of scary things that they could not explain. So for their own comfort and to be able to deal with those things psychologically and on a daily life, they created this imaginary entity for themselves that is God or gods, depending on which school you follow. Because some people, some theorists say that originally it was one God that became multiple gods, and another theory says no, they were multiple gods right from the beginning. Regardless, they created divinity figures that were going to give them hope that they can withstand and go through the difficulties that they're encountering in their lives because they believe in them. And then everything, the rituals and the religion were created all around that. So that's the claim. That's the theory that was presented by a few sociologists, and that spread very quickly because that became the way to reject religion and to say, see, initially it started in these primitive societies where people were afraid of nature, and today we understand how nature works. I understand how, why there's thunder and why there's lightning. I understand that there's a reaction, there's a negative and a positive, and it's humid and. That's why I see a spark that becomes lightning. And that lightning is also the explanation of the thunder. Okay. So that's, generally speaking, the objection. So the answer. First of all that tells us, all that provides to us, is that it's a possibility. And in fact, there's not really a lot of evidence for it. It may sound like a nice story, but until you can provide actual evidence that that's how human beings started believing in God, this remains an empty possibility, like many others. I can come up with 10 other stories. So why this one and not another one? I need proof that this is why humanity started believing in God. In this lesson, we provided another one. We said human beings have an instinct, and that instinct leans towards believing in an absolute, in a sacred, in a holy. And this religious sense that we refer to it is instinctive in all human beings. That's another story. It's not my fear of natural phenomena. Okay, so that's one. It's a possibility and it requires a lot more evidence. Second answer. If we look at the believers throughout history, and let's come all the way down to, the past couple of centuries, but we could do that throughout history. In the past couple of centuries, because they think there's been a turn, there has been a milestone with the scientific theory, there's scientific revolution, and so on. So fine, let's dismiss all the great minds from before and look from that point on. Have these people who have been believers in God, all of them, what can we say about them? Are they people who have absolutely no understanding of the natural laws of the world? Can we really say that about all of them? Is that why they believe in God? Because they don't understand how the world works, and so they need this supernatural being to make sense of thunder and earthquakes and floods and other natural disasters that may cause fear in human beings. So the author mentions a couple of names. I put a lot of stuff on this slide very quickly, and we could multiply this by many folds. So he just mentions quickly Albert Einstein. He mentions Carrel. Carrel was a very big biologist, but a little bit controversial because he got involved with the Nazis at some point. But he won the Nobel Prize he was a surgeon and a biologist, and he did, anyways, very big. Abraham Cressy Morrison, and he has very interesting, if you want to, this one is very short piece, an essay he called, I don't know if I refer to it here or not. Here you go. 7 Reasons Why a Scientist Believes in God. So that's an essay that I recommend. It's a quick read, very quick. And he gives 7 reasons, and this guy didn't die that long ago, 1951. And he also wrote a book by the name of Man Does Not Stand Alone. That book was actually a response to Julian Huxley being, a very huge promoter of science and at the same time he had written a book called Man Stands Alone. So he wrote a book in response called Man Does Not Stand Alone. Anyways, just to keep in mind, he also mentions so I'm only mentioning these because the author just mentions a couple of names. So I'm saying a couple of words about each one of the names. And at the end he says, and the reader can refer back to a book that we've referred to here before called The Evidence of God in an Expanding Universe. So this book has been translated in multiple languages. It's 1958, I believe, the initial publication, and it was translated Allah Yatajalla Fil Ilm, or something like that in Arabic, if those who want to read it in Arabic. It's a very well-known book. In English it's The Evidence of God in an Expanding Universe. I don't know if you can find it online. You have to find the old copies of the book. Yeah.
An interesting fact that came by saying, even Darwin himself wasn't a staunch atheist.
No, he talks about God. He believed that.
He was agnostic.
At most, he would be agnostic, but he definitely wasn't an atheist, which is amazing.
Yes. Yes, and so let's look at a few other names that I added I'm like, maybe these have even more of a punch, depending on who the reader is and how much you know about these people. I added just a few names very quickly. For instance, Francis Collins. So Francis Collins is an author and a researcher and a scientist today. And for those who don't know, he was the leader of the Human Genome Project. And he wrote a book called The Language of God. Okay, and it talks about biology, that's his field. He's very interesting. I think it's a very good read. I recommend it, The Language of God. Others, for instance, Erwin Schrödinger. So anyone who knows a little bit about theoretical physics, astrophysics, quantum theory, let's look at a few names. Erwin Schrödinger, Louis Pasteur, microbiology. He's well known to have said things like, every time I look into my microscope, my belief in God becomes more solid. Isaac Newton, he was well known to be obsessed with the Bible and numerology, and theology was one of his expertise, and he's basically saying, I'm discovering the laws that God put in nature. But this, Newton would require a lecture on his own, because he caused a problem that I'll mention very quickly later, which is the God of the scientific gap. But we'll talk about that in a second. James Clerk Maxwell, so he's the one who basically put together the entire theory of electromagnetism. Okay. Who else? William Thomson Kelvin. So, this guy was huge in his time. And today, for instance, in his honor, we have something like the Kelvin zero, or the Kelvin, which is basically the absolute zero, minus 273 or something. That's the coldest point that you can get, 0.5, that you can get to in the universe. That's the lowest temperature you can reach. Anyways, Werner Heisenberg. So a lot of these people are Nobel Prize winners. Okay, the Heisenberg principle, well-known quantum mechanics. Max Planck, physicist, Nobel Prize winner. Galileo, he was a believer in God, he just had issues with the church. Okay, so, and the list goes on and on and on. So are you telling me that all those people have absolutely no idea how nature works? And that's why they believe in God, out of fear? Because primitive societies believed in God initially out of fear, and those people continued after having spent this much time understanding nature and all of its laws, and each of these people remained a staunch believer. And in a scientific society where sometimes it's completely ridiculed, it's not the current to be a believer. Okay, you're going against current to remain a believer openly, so that your biographers in history can come back after and say this person was a believer. And maybe a very quick point I had here, unfortunately you don't see the slides anymore, but I had a very quick point, and it's arguable, but there's been a study called the Nobel Prize winners, and they looked at the Nobel Prize winners of between 1901 and 2000. Now, the study has been questioned by a lot, okay, but I'll give you very quick figures. In that study, without going into the details, in that study the person said, Shalev, published in 2003, they say that 10.5 around there % of the Nobel Prize winners between 1901 and 2000 identified themselves as atheists or agnostics. 10.5%. Which means that the other 90% fell into one of the two religions, because majorly it was people who were Jewish and Christian who won. Okay, 65 point something Christian and about 20 something % Jews. Okay, between 1901 and 2000. This has been argued by others. People have questioned this study specifically. Okay, so some have recalculated and said it's closer to 18% atheists. Fine, I'll give you 30%. I'll give you 50%. Okay, let's say it's fivefold, 50%. That still tells me that there are as many great minds in humanity who, while they understand economics and literature and physics and biology and chemistry and so on and so forth, these great minds still believe in God, and not because of their ignorance of nature or their fear of nature. It cannot be. So why is it only on one side that you say science, let's look at scientists and scientists who are more atheistic and relying on nature and natural laws and materialistic laws? Well, let's look at them. What do they actually say? So if we say that based on this it's 10%, and as I said, let's go up to 50%. 50%, it's equal, it's fair ground. It means that they're and numbers should not matter in this one. It should be the validity of your argument. But let's say that they do. We would still have half of the population of these great minds, and generally speaking in humanity, which is still a very small number today, all studies show that the atheist population or agnostic population is very small in the world. So even if it wasn't, it's still as valid to believe as not believe. If you want to claim that not believing is logic or more logical, don't come and tell me that it's only because you don't understand how nature works, or how evolution works, or how the Big Bang works. Because these people are the ones who came up with these theories, and they put them in place, and they put all the calculations around them, and they made them work. And yet they still believed in God. So it's not because I believe in the Big Bang, or in quantum mechanics, or quantum physics, or electromagnetism, that I'm going to reject the belief in God. Okay, that's if we want to really push the argument. Yeah.
Who's the belief of the guy from electromagnetism? James something.
Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell. Okay. What else did we have? Motivating feeling does not invalidate the outcome. So, let's pretend for a second that humanity did, or some people in humanity did start believing in God because out of fear of things they were confronted with in nature. Let's agree with that. Does that mean that the belief in itself is wrong? Because these are two different things. So I can look, let's say at, I don't know, I go to 10 people, whether it's something like a poem you wrote, or a philosophical work you did, or a field you went to, or coming to a mosque. Okay? If I ask you what was your motivation, one person's motivation may have been pure and sincere and correct, and everybody would agree that this is a very good way to approach this. You went in engineering for the right reasons. Good. You came to the mosque for the right reasons. Okay, you didn't come to just to show off. Okay. But let's assume that you did come just to show off. The intention is wrong. But is the final act still wrong? No. The coming to the mosque is not an issue here. The motivation may be problematic, and we have to fix the motivation, but I'm not going to tell you don't come to the mosque. I'm going to tell you come to the mosque because that was a good move, a good act. There's no issue with the act itself. These are two distinct things. The act and the intention of the act. If you want to tell me that the intention, the initial motivation for believing in God was fear, fine. Maybe some people mistakenly began their journey towards God out of fear. That doesn't invalidate the belief itself. They came to it through the wrong path, assuming that they came to it through the wrong path. That does not mean that the belief itself, or that God doesn't exist, or the belief is wrong. That we can establish, and as we have, through other means. So we can come back and question, maybe your belief was wrong. And this could be as a result of ignorance, it could be as a result of what you go through in life that's too much for your level of knowledge, whatever. The other point I wanted to mention here, and the author doesn't talk about it, is the assumption that because it was triggered by fear, the fear itself is problematic. I think there's another way to argue this one. So what's wrong with fear? So my initial, the first step in my journey towards God may have been triggered by fear.
It could be right. It could be your way.
Yeah, so the question here becomes, why is my journey towards God, if the first step in that journey was triggered by fear, because I'm living in nature and I have these problems, why would that be problematic? It doesn't necessarily need to be. It could be argued that it is, okay, and that's the main claim, and I understand how that could be argued, but I think the counter argument could also be made. And that's a little bit what we talked about at the beginning of the course when we talked about the human instinctive need for religion and for God. We talked about the examples of a human being who is facing extreme struggles. If your human being is pushed enough, cornered enough, we said a lot of psychologists say that if you dig deep enough in a human being, confronted with enough problems and struggles, what you find is God. Or whatever you find is what we refer to as God. Okay, you find that thing, that hope that's left inside of that human being, they turn towards something, that's God. And we said even the Holy Quran corroborates this. when it talks about people who go on a ship and they invoke and beseech and cry out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while they're on their ship because they think they're going to die in a storm. And then as soon as they reach land, إِذَا هُمْ بِهِ يُشْرِكُونَ. You go back to your worship, whatever you were worshipping before, the difficulty is over. And so we talked a little bit about how do we become of the kind of people who don't only remember God in a difficult situation, right? We remember that. So if that was okay, and that was a justified, proper, rational argument for the human instinctive way of leaning towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the argument could be turned on its head. And we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in us these elements, they're kind of leftovers that He put, or factors that He has left in our being that help us go back to Him depending on the situations we're in. So one of those situations is fear. When you're in a situation of fear, you have something in you that turns towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's like you never lose track. No matter what happens, that thing is always directed. There's always something directing you back. So the argument could be made in the opposite sense, and that's not talked about in the book at all. And the last point that he makes about this fear and ignorance for the belief in God is the misunderstanding of the causality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we talked a lot about causality. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But in a lot of cases, if the issue is, let me use an example. Okay, the issue is they don't make a distinction. Some people don't make a distinction between what we can call a vertical cause and a horizontal cause. Okay, so this needs a little bit of an explanation. Let's say you and your spouse go to a store and you want to buy something. So the options are you pay or your spouse pays. You're at the counter. Okay. So this relationship, this scenario, is one of horizontality. The payment is one of horizontality. You or, okay, A or B. You're at the same level, and the money is coming from this pocket or that pocket. And they're at the same level. It's got almost like a competition, mutually exclusive, one or the other. Okay? So that's a relationship of horizontality. And this is something to keep in mind for causality in general. Always keep it in mind. That's one type of relationship. The other one is you go to the store with your child and you've given them money before they come in. They go in. And once you reach the cash, they take out their money and they pay. So who paid here? The child or the parent? You could say both. The child may have done the act, but ultimately the money came from the parent. Right? This is a relationship of verticality. This is a vertical causation. So the child pays. The child is performing the act, but it's only valid, it can only work insofar as it's been enabled by an antecedent cause, a previous cause that allowed it, that enabled it, that empowered it to perform this action. If you understand causality and the necessary cause or the necessary being as a relationship of verticality with all the causes, you don't fall into the problems of what we're facing now with science, which is, I look at the world, I thought God causes lightning and thunder, and now today I discover that no, there are actually natural mechanisms that interact with each other and they cause thunder and lightning. Because I'm viewing it's either God or these natural phenomena. And now I've explained them with natural phenomena. I no longer need God. Because in my mind, it's a horizontal causality. So it's either coming from here, God, or coming from here, natural cause. Okay, I found the natural cause, no longer need God. But if you understand what we've said so far, we said that the necessary being is the final, ultimate cause. Which means that all the causes can only take place under it. You're not replacing. If they're happening, it's because they've been enabled to happen. They've been allowed, empowered to happen in that manner. So no matter how much rational, natural, scientific explanations you can give me, you're never going to be able to replace the vertical causality. What you're doing is adding at the horizontal level, you're adding explanation upon explanation, but you're never going to the ultimate reason that's enabling all of this to work. So this is an important point to keep in mind, especially now as the scientific interpretations of the world are increasing. If you understand that, you don't fall into this trap. You don't have this problem. Okay, there's a lot of examples for this, but we'll stop here for now.
Sayid,
Yeah.
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You still have 5 minutes.
No, go.
Yeah?
Yes.
When you said that, I want to ask if I'm understanding this right about, like, I know about atheists, and they don't necessarily explain things through cause and effect, but they kind of seem to find a middle ground between, and they say, like, this is the habit of God. So there's wood, there's fire, and the wood is burning, but the wood isn't burning because of the fire, but this is just the habit of God that this happens. It's kind of a middle explanation between the two, where it's not cause and effect. Well, no, it's just burning because it's just the habit of it to burn when there's fire.
They have so much belief in the tawheed, in the efficient agent causality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they say it's not it's not this burning, it's not the fire that's burning, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's burning, and it just so happens.
It just so happens.
Yes. So they went a little too far, because the way, in principle, it's true, but they're mixing up things.
Yeah.
The reality is, the Quran says, for instance, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has enabled things to be what they are. He's given them those powers, and none of them exist or act independently. That we agree on.
Yeah.
But we also disagree that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the end, He's enabled them. It means that they are the ones doing. And that's why, like, even if you look at things like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Jesus or Ibrahim alayhi salam to perform certain miracles, He tells them, you're the one doing. Right? تَصْنَعُ مِنَ الطِّيَرِ. You're doing it. I'm not doing. It's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's doing it. But of course, بِإِذْنِي. With my permission, with my authority, with my power. You do. But you do. And so when they come back, the Ash'ara, and they say, no, it's not. It's
Lightning
all
is
God.
just lightning.
Yes. And so of course you're going to fall into determinism that way. Which they do, and they don't see a problem with. Anyway. Okay. Principle of causality. That's the other one. First point, very quickly, I'm going to go a little bit faster here. First point about causality. The only real objection to causality that has really been, worth considering, and I'm not going to explain it now, but if ever you hear someone say, because everything we're talking about is relying on the principle of causality, right? So the only objection, serious objection to the principle of causality came from David Hume. He's a philosopher who, like John Locke, David Hume, George Berkeley, those are philosophers in the empirical tradition, empiricists. And David Hume went further than anyone else and basically questioned everything and demolished causality, or he thought he did. And he talks about conjunction. He says human beings see event A and event B, and they come up with this idea that there's causality between them, and there's no causality between them. And so he's very Ash'ari in that sense, but it's not because of extra tawheed that he has. Okay, in fact, he says the opposite. He says it's impossible to prove anything. And Kant was very influenced by David Hume. Anyway.
That says a lot about Ash'ari if Hume could come to
Of course. A very good thesis could be written about the commonalities between Hume and the Ash'ari. Anyways. So I'm not going to spend any time on this, because really in the world, who would argue against causality? Like, who says there is no causality and there's no cause and effect? And I disagree with the principle of causality. I mean, nothing stands if you get rid of that principle. Okay? So if anyone is interested, I would recommend going back and reading about David Hume and what other philosophers and thinkers have said about him. If you want to specifically read from an Islamic point of view, although you don't necessarily need to, but Islamically, our philosophy, Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, he talks about principle of causality, and he responds to David Hume and others, and there's other books on it as well. So keep that in mind. That's one. Two.
Yeah. Like 1/6 of the world would believe in, like, the Sunni school are mostly Ash'arites, and they would agree to there's no.
I don't think they all know that this is what they're supposed to believe.
But this is what they're supposed to believe.
Yeah, but they don't know that. It's very advanced. Second point, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, because again, this one we've covered before. And this is the main objection about causality. So the objection, we've covered it before in lesson 7. We said the objection is if everything needs a cause, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needs a cause. Or then I can apply the same logic you're going to give me to matter and energy. Okay, so that was the objection. Answer. The answer, without going into too much detail and not repeating myself too much, we said it's not everything that needs a cause, it's every contingent thing, every dependent thing, every conditional thing, non-autonomous thing needs a cause. If you're a contingent thing like matter and energy that does not have being as part of your essence, as part of your definition, matter does not need to exist, so something must have caused it to exist. You can't just come back and tell me, I'm going to apply the principle of causality just like you apply it on God to matter or energy. For materialism specifically and matter, we'll talk more about it in the next lesson, but this one is, I think we've covered it enough. Last objection, findings of empirical science. So the claim here, the objection is that belief in God is not compatible with the findings of natural science. For instance, a lot of people refer to, let's say, energy or matter, because they are the same now based on theory of relativity. You can go back and forth between them. Energy or matter is a constant in the universe. You can never create it, you can never destroy it, you can only transform it. So anyone who knows thermodynamics, this is one of the laws of thermodynamics. In other words, they basically say, if nothing can be created, then I just eliminated God. Nothing is created out of nothing. Okay, so the answer. And the second objection related to this, so this is one good example. The other good example is the theory of evolution. He doesn't talk about any others. I can add to that, like the Big Bang theory and. Okay. The answer. The first one I'll mention very quickly here, without going into too much detail. It's not talked about. He doesn't drill into the specific proofs. Just to understand the laws of thermodynamics, there's an assumption in those laws that everybody has to understand. So the moment anyone goes in that argument, keep in mind that these laws only work in isolated systems. If you can create a system where you isolate it from anything else, for instance the universe, then you can have these laws work as they're supposed to, and you can make the math work and you can make the formulas work. The moment that system becomes open to other things, then you can't control all the variables, you can't make the calculations, and you have a problem. So if you consider the universe as a closed system, or Earth as a closed system, you can work with it. This does not necessarily mean that all of this happened on its own and there's nothing outside of this universe, or that this universe was not put in place with these laws in it. I don't know if that's making sense. Why is this universe a closed system? And the fundamental question with math and science, why are these constants in the universe? Where do these constants come from? There's a book called Only 6 Numbers. I really recommend that people read it. That book talks about 6 constants by a very big mathematician, very respected, who considers himself an atheist/agnostic. But he basically says if any of these variables were to change, we would not have reality, or at least not reality as we know it. Matter cannot come together as matter if any of these 6 numbers would change. So he drills down to these 6 constants. Others have said there's 20, whatever, even if there was only one. Where does that constant come from? Is not that the by design argument? It means there's design. I need nothing else but those numbers to tell you there's design. If those numbers change, nothing works. Okay, keep that in mind. First point he makes, he doesn't explain it, so I won't either, but that's a whole topic. Natural science is not equipped to talk about things outside of natural science of the empirical world. So I think that's clear enough. We can spend hours talking about this, but that's the gist of it. Philosophy of science is dedicated to this. 2, constant energy does not replace the need for a creator. It still needs to come from somewhere. Why? As we said, because it's a contingent being. It could exist and it could not exist. So philosophically, if you look at something and it's only a possible existence, something must have pulled it out of that limbo, existential limbo we called it, into existence. Otherwise, why does it exist? And this is the question that science cannot answer. Why does it exist? Why is it this way? It can give me the mechanisms, but it cannot give me the ultimate why. But why is it that way? Why is it that fire burns? I understand the chemistry and I understand the physics, but why does it burn? Why was it that someone somewhere somehow decided that fire is going to burn? Anyways, there's different ways to ask that same question, so we're not going to spend more time on that. Life, feelings, soul, awareness, all of that we already talked about. All of these material entities, we cannot necessarily explain them with even these biggest, highest level of natural principles, natural explanations, such as the laws of thermodynamics. I'm not sure to what extent the laws of thermodynamics can explain the will or consciousness. Okay? And then finally, 3 quick points about theory of evolution, because he talks about it. First of all, and he says, the theory is scientifically questionable, with people in the field who have questions about it. So don't talk about it as though it's a 100% ascertained claim. There's still work that science needs to do before even it completely convinces all of its people that the theory actually stands in the way that it's being presented. 1. 2. The theory only gives us the preparatory causes.